Hello, everybody. Welcome to the sixth episode of At World's Edge. This is going to be a kind of a different episode because I'm going to be talking about how it is that I get to the information that I get to. Essentially, how we know what we know about fantasy lore, because there are so many different sources to look at, especially when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy, a game that's been around for literally decades, and whose sources are not actually all being made by one person or two people, a team of people, or even by the same company at this point. While the IP is all being essentially controlled by Games Workshop, at this point there are companies making games. Creative Assembly is making Total War Warhammer. Citadel 7 is making the fantasy role-playing game. And of course, Games Workshop proper is making Warhammer the Old World in theory, but at least in the past they made Warhammer Fantasy Battles and controlled all of the army books there. And Black Library is, of course, while part of Games Workshop, they are a little bit of a separate thing, and they made the fictional books that went along with that world as well. So there are so many different things to look at, and I thought it'd be good to give a look at how I find the information I look at so that you know what I'm talking about when I go over my videos. So without further ado, let's talk about fantasy scholarship and how we know what we know. So firstly, a little bit about my background. I am trained as an historian, and the first thing we look at when we're evaluating something historically is a source. And there's two types of sources primarily, a primary and a secondary source. And a primary source is something that directly interacted with the event. So a primary source might be a quote or a report, and they're your best information. So like someone who witnessed an event, or maybe a report from a battle, or a receipt from a purchase. Those are all primary sources. So taking a look at this incarnate elemental of death, for example, the primary source on here is going to be the quote at the bottom. So, having seen the destructive capabilities of dragons, I find it eminently suitable that the embodiment of the Wind of Shyish takes the form of such a beast. So we know from the Lokar Garrett that the incarnate elemental of death takes the form of a dragon. We know that because he saw one and he wrote about it in person. We can take this, as long as we trust Lokar, we can take this absolutely for gospel that it is a viable piece of information. A secondary source is a piece of information that comes secondhand, and it's considered to be less valuable, not unvaluable. And that's, their secondary sources are still incredibly useful, and it's where most scholarship comes from. The secondary source here is going to be the top portion, and it represents, at least in theory, and it's how I treat them at least, as a collected wisdom, or the embodiment of knowledge that whoever created this beast entry, whoever compiled this monstrous arcanum, whatever scholar that was, that's what they put together. And I can trust it because we're assuming that the person who put it together, the imperial scholar or the mage who wrote the book, is going to be using sources that are reliable or reputable in their own right. And so we can trust it, but it's not quite as reliable as Lokar himself. And so the description they put there is still good, but ultimately I would rather be able to look at the primary sources myself. And this, of course, is in microcosm, but ultimately it applies to anything. So when we're looking at lore events, like let's say, most recently I did the video on the Elves of Lorelorn. We have a lot of primary and secondary material there. We can look at the fantasy Warhammer role-playing game, which has the books on their careers and their lifestyle, and those are both secondary and primary sources because it has quotes that talk about interacting with them, and then it has quotes from their actual people. And those are, that's where we're getting the information that I talked about from. Primarily I used the War of Vengeance series, which is a primary source because it tells the story from the position of Leandra and Sebekai, which were Drukai and Asur, who became the first elves from the Eomir at the time of the War of the Beard. And then I also looked at the primary sources from the Warhammer Fantasy Battles role-playing game 4th edition book, and also the 1st edition book, which included some quotes from people who interacted with elves, and also some talking about elves, which are primary and secondary sources. So both valuable, but different kinds of scholarship there. So who do you trust? Like we just talked about, use both sources, and they're both first person, so they're both valuable. They're both trustworthy. But who do you trust more? At the end of the day, you want to trust both of them, but I did put a little bit more stock in the War of the Vengeance series for certain parts of it. So when talking, there were some incongruencies between the two when it came to the foundation of the Lorelorn Forest Elves. Essentially, in the fantasy roleplay book, it talked a little bit about how they were formed, specifically with regards to the dwarves showed up and they asked to sack the Lorelorn Forest capital, and they summoned the Grey Lords to fight them off. And that's all fundamentally true, but it was missing a couple of the details, and those salient details were answered in the War of Vengeance series. The kind of loss of salient detail is very common in historical study because essentially those things happened 7,000 years ago. Even for immortal elves, we can assume that they're going to have a little bit of loss of fidelity, a loss of information, simply due to how long ago the information happened. And there's no reason that we can't assume that the War of Vengeance series, which takes place in the first-person perspective, in the minds and the eyes of the people while it's happening, wouldn't be the best source of information. So that would be where I was looking at, and that was the best source of information for me while I was doing that study. The next thing to consider while I'm looking at these videos is historiography, which is not the study of history, that's just history. Historiography is the study of how history has been studied, which is especially important for a game as long as Warhammer, because remember, games have to evolve. And while history, the study of history has to evolve all the time because historians are constantly discovering new things about history, a game evolves even quicker because it has to evolve to market forces. So, for example, this is Wood Elf lore from the Warhammer Rulebook 6th edition. And you'll notice it's pretty small. It's part of a page, 3 paragraphs. Just one edition later, it's 3 paragraphs long. And you'll notice it also is missing even a little bit of a mention of the Lorelorn Elves, who I did the video on. So it definitely changes. There was a lot more information, a lot more focus on the lore, and a whole lack of mention of even a whole portion of their lore that they just weren't even going to be doing anything on. They weren't even in their book, in the book that was released during that edition. So there's definitely a change there, and focusing on why that change happened is the focus of historiography. The Lorelorn Elves didn't disappear. They were still in fantasy roleplay. They were still in the War of Vengeance series. They just weren't in the Warhammer Fantasy Battles rulebook or the Fantasy Battles Battle Tome. Now, why does this happen? It happens for a variety of reasons. It may be that they want to focus on something. So, for example, the High Elf book here wanted to focus on different kinds of units, so they changed the focus of their lore from the relatively low impact kind of writing that they had in the first book on the left to the much, much more detailed and more world-spanning lore that they had on the right that incorporated a lot of different races, so that while you were thinking about your races and what you were doing in your own world and army building, you could imagine how they would be fighting, how they'd be playing. You could have a better sort of visual in your head about where your army could be playing and what kinds of things it would be doing, which ultimately makes you a more involved painter and you more involved in playing your games and you more likely to buy more minis. So that's a great reason for them. It also helps them flesh out things that may have been missed in the past, which especially happened, let's say, with the Vampire Counts. This is the Vampire Counts sixth edition book. You'll notice it's a nice map. It's got some pretty cool things on there, but it's nowhere near their 8th edition rulebook, which is a beautiful rendering, but it still has many of the same essential pieces on it, but nothing at all close to this guy. It's just very, very sparse. See? Yeah, much more sparse. And ultimately, that's a good change. And it doesn't really retcon anything, but it does add a lot more in there and really helps stoke your imagination a little bit. And that kind of a change does go into what I'd be looking at when making these videos. So what changed between these two maps? What do I need to focus on from a lore perspective? Did something move? Why did the Tower of Melchior move from one part of the map to the other? Because the Tower of Melchior on the first map was located here. The Tower of Melchior on the first map was located on the right side and moved to the left side in the new map. Why did that happen? Is it lore important? Did it move in the lore? That's a question I'd have to ask, or maybe it just moved because they felt like moving it. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of an insight. I'll be coming back next week with a video on the Southlands and what that means to the Lorehammer lore versus in the fantasy tabletop game and also the Total War Warhammer series. And I hope you'll tune into that. Please enjoy the videos I put out so far, and please click like and subscribe. Your likes mean a lot, and they keep this channel going and help it get off the ground. You have a great day and a great weekend.